assume, let's bring that back up, mute that. Moderation, I know. Okay. And, okay, that's working. Do, 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 do.
Which one is it? No, that one is.
Okay.
Because that's what I have. This is the same thing. This one.
Great.
This one will also work.
Right, that's the wrong book.
But the thing doesn't actually come off, so you don't use it.
Ba, 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 ba. All right.
That's right. It's like the first generation one. The first generation you take it off and then you charge it, but this one's a newer version and then
So do y'all have any questions before we got into the stuff? No. All good? Okay. All right. So we ended with this. Bleh. With, you know, where's my mouse? Is it over here? It's over here. Yeah, the Ionian Greeks here causing trouble for Persia, which is all of this. And that'll be more for the next chapter. But again, like, this is just, bleh, I can't talk. This just goes to show you how, as we progress into, like, each chapter, we get more and more into more of the world, because, like, here's Babylonia. Like, this is all of Mesopotamia right here. And there's Egypt. And there's Greece. So this is like all of what we were talking about already. This is chapter 1 and 2 in a single part of the map. And then there's the rest of Persia, which is like more than everything else. So Persia by itself is more landmass than everything we've talked about so far. All right. So, as I also mentioned, when it came to the first invasion, the polis weren't completely unified on how to respond. Athens and other democratic polis, again, we'll talk more about what exactly that meant a little bit later, wanted the other polis to resist Persia. They saw them as tyrants. Again, their own interpretation of how Persia governed itself, which is not quite the same as Greek tyrants, but, you know, again, just from their own viewpoint. Sparta and other polis on Peloponnesia didn't really want to get involved, although Sparta had actually fought Persia in the past, and would benefit from Persia being pushed back. In fact, they would be very disadvantaged if Persia did invade Greece, but they didn't want to get involved because, as we're going to see a lot with Sparta, they're not this big expansionist military that they're often made out to be in fiction. They were really conservative, quite literally. They wanted to stay where they were and not be bothered with anybody else. But for the most part, most polis didn't really want to be bothered at all. They were concerned with what they were doing, or were fighting each other. This outside force of Persia wasn't really their concern. It was the Ionian Greeks' problem and not theirs. However, the island polis of Aegina symbolically submitted to Persia. Athens rallied Sparta and Corinth to attack them, and after this, Aegina agreed to an anti-Persian stance, which, while it seemed like Athens was trying to keep all the polis against Persia, it actually was a pragmatic issue, because if Aegina had actually decided to work with Persia, Athens wouldn't have been able to defeat the combined Aegean and Archie. I don't know what that would have been. The combined fleet of Aegina and Persia. Because while Athens probably had the best fleet out of all of the Greek polis, Persia had a pretty good fleet, and Aegina also had a really good fleet, and those two combined would have been too much for Athens to handle. Now, this is actually both of the Persian invasions. Again, we'll get to this in a little bit. But this is... Persia didn't really do a whole lot, despite it being called the Persian Wars. It was really just two relatively small invasions, at least from Persia's standpoint. So for Darius, and thus Persia as a whole, this was an affront to his power. This was, I mean, he saw this as an insult more than anything else. Greece was just where he was going to continue the expansion of Persia. And I mean, as I've said in other classes, I've played enough, empire building games where it's like, well, this is the next area, and I'm just going to roll into it, and sorry, people living there, this is mine now. So, I mean, I get where Darius is coming from. I mean, he's got all this other land. Greece is just, like, barely even a blip on the map. Also, Darius's advisors told him that Greece was weak, fragmented, fighting each other, and it wouldn't be that hard to conquer. And they were right about some of that. Greece was fragmented and fighting each other. I mean, they were constantly warring with one another. There was no real unity among the Greeks until they had to fight together. And then there was really an unexpected strength among the Greeks. But even then, they weren't fully unified. We'll see that in the second invasion. So during this first invasion, which really for Persia was like, almost like a, what's the military term? Not a prodding force. Like, they were just sending a force in to just kind of test the defenses of Greece. 25,000 soldiers, which again, for Persia was barely anything. They went in 490 BCE. Only the Athenians were able to arrive in time to stop them. Now, the Athenians only had 10,000 men available to fight. So they're outnumbered 2.5 to 1. I mean, 25,000 versus 10,000 at the Battle of Marathon. However, due to superior tactics, and I mean, based on this image I'm about to show you guys, also like superior, holding superior ground, and also the Greeks also had like better armor and weapons. When you've got an army the size of Persia, as I mentioned last time, you mostly just like gave them enough armor to cover their junk and a knife, and you just sent them to stab the other guys. And when you've got an army of like 300,000, you're going to just overwhelm them. The Greeks, for their part, tended to have shields, spears, some amount of bronze armor. They weren't like fully armored knights like you think of in the Middle Ages, but they had more than like a loincloth and a knife. So, yeah, the Athenians lost several hundred men, but they killed about 6,000 Persians and forced the Persians back and won the Battle of Marathon. So we've got this image here of the Persians moving in, again, in much larger numbers. The Greeks actually having this line here pulled the Persians forward into this valley, essentially, and then rallied forward, forcing the Persians into tighter and tighter spaces, and then they flanked the Persians and really took them apart. We'll actually see this sort of similar tactics to this when we get into the Punic Wars, or the Second Punic War in Roman history. Also, you may recognize the word marathon. I hope you've heard the word marathon before. Supposedly, this is another one of the whole like Athenian propaganda things, but supposedly a runner, a messenger, at the Battle of Marathon, once the battle was won, he ran the distance from the battlefield to Athens, which is the distance of a modern-day marathon, all the way to Athens, all the way to the top of the Acropolis, declared the victory for Athens, and then dropped dead of exhaustion. Because, even the messenger died for Athens. But the distance between Marathon and Athens, whatever, I don't know the exact distance of what a marathon is, but that's the distance that a modern marathon is, because everybody's really into classical Greece, apparently. So there was a period of time between the two Persian invasions, about 10 years almost, 8 years here. And for Persia, it was a minor setback. It was one battle. It was 25,000 dudes, which for them, again, was barely anything. They only lost, 6,000 guys? Yeah, 6,000 Persians, which, again, for them was barely even counted. But in the politics of Greece, it was huge. Obviously, Athens increased its political standing, set themselves up as the saviors of all the Greeks. They used propaganda and warships against polis and citizens that did not fully support the resistance. So if you didn't support them, they would either, they would ostracize you. Now, today we use the word ostracism in a purely social sense of, just destroying your social credibility. But back then, this was a way to essentially kick you out of the city. You would be, quote, democratically expelled from a city. This was for dangerous people, those who, supported Persia and wanted them to invade. But basically, it was used to just kick out political rivals. We have evidence in the book. It's page 55 for me. Again, I don't know for those of you that might have got your hands on the book. Considerable physical information can be gathered from the Ostraka, which is the name of the ostracons. Let's see. Location, number and composition, nature of the pottery, etc., etc. 191 Ostraka, all bearing the name of Themistocles, was found discarded in a well. Shards came from the same general pottery source and bear the inscriptions of only 14 different scribes. Basically, these votes were rigged. These supposedly democratic ways of expelling people from cities because they were dangerous or they were going to cause trouble for society. It wasn't really actually democratic. It was, most of the people were illiterate, so they didn't actually know who they were voting for or what was going in the pot, and they would swap the pots around. This actually, oddly enough, because I started playing Assassin's Creed Odyssey again because talking about Greece makes me want to see Greece again. That's actually a mission. Is you can choose to swap the ostracon around and cheat the ballot like they actually did back then. So around this time, Sparta created the Peloponnesian League. Their main goal was to get Argos, which was a city near Mycenae. It's a city that's not quite on the, well, it is on the Peloponnesian landmass, but it's right at the edge of it. The whole point was to get Argos to join them. Argos did not join them, but they kept the league so that other nearby city-states would help them maintain their slave population because, as I mentioned, the slave population was so large that that's why Sparta had its whole warrior society, because they needed to keep their slave population under control. And they weren't really into invading other cities or really sending their warriors out at all. Because if they did, there was this concern that the slaves would rebel, because they often did. So this is an ostraka, or ostracon rather. It's a piece of broken pottery with a name inscribed in it. Because hey, if you've used the pottery already and it's busted up, might as well use the pieces. It's like a torn piece of paper, essentially. It's like, okay, we've already used the paper, we're not going to use it anymore. Let's go ahead and use that to count a vote on. Which to me is it's actually kind of neat to look back in the past and see, they didn't have a lot of paper lying around. That was still pretty rare and expensive. But they had pottery galore. So we're not using this pot anymore. Smash it and use the shards as scraps of paper to carve names in. So here we've got the Peloponnesian League down here. I don't think the rest of this is the Delian League. We'll get into the Delian League in a minute. And then there, of course, is Persia, just sort of looming over here, which again, Persia is, this is 0.5% of Persia. All right. So as I said, there were 2 invasions from Persia. However, they had other issues to deal with. before dealing with Greece again. Egypt had overthrown their Persian rulers. Darius had kicked the bucket. So his son Xerxes was now in control, went down to Egypt, restored control in Egypt, and began preparing to conquer Greece like his father had tried to do before. So during this period of calm between the two wars, Persia had sent, my brain's not working, agents, that's the word I'm looking for. Persia sent agents into Greece to divide the Greeks, offering leniency to Polis if they'd side with the Persians, or just not work with the Greeks. Again, though, a lot of Polis were more than happy to side with the Greeks because for them, they've been fighting other Polis for hundreds of years, and this new empire that's shown up out of nowhere doesn't really seem like that big of a deal. That, hey, they're coming in, they're going to have, stable rule. They're going to keep these other Polis from invading us all the time. Yeah, that seems like a pretty good deal. I mean, it will be like if, I don't know, all the states were independent and say Georgia was constantly trying to invade us, and Canada comes in. It's like, hey, we're going to take you guys over and keep you from invading each other all the time. Maybe we'd be cool with that because we're tired of Georgia invading us all the time. So all the Polis met together in Corinth in 41, but they weren't able to come to an agreement of what to do with Persia, and nearly a third decided to just sit out entirely. So again, despite this idea that there was this big unification of the Greek world, a full third just didn't want to be involved. So the big players in the second invasion were mostly Athens and Sparta, and a lot of smaller Polis were more concerned about Athens and Sparta than they were about Persia, which again it feels weird. But I mean, when you're used to fighting these guys for, again, centuries, this new player doesn't seem like that big a deal. So the Second Persian War was an actual invasion rather than just a single battle. Again, it feels weird calling the First Persian War an actual war because it was a single battle, but whatever. So the first part of the war was the land war. That's the 300,000 men led by Xerxes across the Hellespont into Europe. This was the Battle of Thermopylae, again, led by King Leonidas and his 300 Spartans, as well as he had Greek allies that stood with him. Let's see. Yeah, it just mentions the 300 Spartans, but there were a few thousand like Lydians, I believe. But the final stand was the remaining 300 Spartans after the initial battle. He sent the other ones home, and they were going to do their last stand at the hill. So after killing a lot of Persians, and the Spartans were killed, Athens was invaded, which had already been abandoned. So Xerxes had the Acropolis burned, and then he went back to Persia because, I mean, Persia's huge and he's got a lot to deal with over there. I mean, to the Persians, this is like kicking over an anthill. There's other stuff to deal with. So his business continued to gradually take over Greece. And the rest of the war was mostly naval battles. Little skirmishes between the Persian Navy and the Athenian Navy where no one side ever really won. Excuse me. You can get that a lot of naval battles where they'll just kind of hit each other and back off, and that'll happen again later on. Eventually, the Athenians lured the Persians into a small body of water near Salamis and wiped them out. And even Persia couldn't rebuild their fleet fast enough to account for this loss. So finally, 497, which, the following year, Spartans, Athenians, and their allies, including, so he doesn't mention the various allies. There were Thracians. I think I've got a map that shows more. The book really does not give enough detail. Defeated the Persians and their Greek allies at the Battle of Plataea, because again, there were plenty of Greeks that were working with the Persians. So, the final battle of the final major battle, because there were still some pockets of Persians in Greece, but this was the final major battle of the Second Persian War at Plataea, probably important. Here's the Battle of Thermopylae. There was this was the big initial battle, and they were able to hold the Persians off. And there was apparently a traitor among the Spartans who told the Persians of this goat path around the mountain, so that a group of the Persian army was able to encircle the Spartans, which led to the final battle at the Hill of the Last Stand. So, the rest of the chapter is really just Greece responding to this new world they've created. Because Persia's still there, but Athens and Sparta are now these big powers. The smaller cities now sort of have to deal with the balance of power having shifted. It actually increased the disunity of the polis. Athens and Sparta were now the front runners, and the smaller polis had to choose one side or the other, or, as we're going to see later on, actually be absorbed by one or the other. And while historians, we try to not go into what ifs, because, it's history and you don't really do what ifs. Had Persia won, had Persia defeated the Greek cities, it might have actually been more peaceful, because they would have forced the polis to not fight each other. Now, it would have definitely put a hamper on later cultural stuff in Greece, but Greece gets conquered later anyway. But had Persia won in the short term, it would have been much more peaceful for Greece, because they would not have been permitted to fight amongst one another if Persia had a strong hand over them. And while Persia was defeated, it's not like Greece went in and like burned down Persia's capital or anything. They just knocked Persia out of Greece. Persia's still right there. It's right on the other side of the Aegean Sea. And that's not very far away. So when the Polis would be fighting each other, they'd often go to Persia to try to get it involved, which would cause its own issues. So after the Persian War, the two main polis, Sparta and Athens, had very different views on how Greece should how Greece should be following the war. Sparta, one thing, let's go back to the way they were. Sparta was very much, let's keep things how they are. They didn't want anything to change. They didn't want any power to shift. They just wanted to go back and keep their slaves from revolting and keep everybody where they were, and that's it. Athens, though, was getting really aggressive. They wanted to continue pushing the war against Persia, essentially creating an Athenian empire, which we'll get to that a little bit later, by suppressing other polis in order to protect the polis of Greece. Basically, they were claiming they were protecting Greece by conquering Greece. So, one of the, before the Peloponnesian League, let's discuss each of these major cities before we get to the final section of the chapter. Which I sort of feel like we maybe should have done this before the Persian War, but then again, some of these cities really didn't develop into their full selves until after. So Sparta, we've talked a bunch about Sparta. Let's discuss Sparta specifically. Spartans were originally Dorians, which is to say they came from a different region of Greece than, the rest of the Greeks. They came in late. They initially were landlocked, so they weren't on any coastline initially. Ooh, excuse me. And they began conquering the native populations for soldiers and farmers, which, that causes its own issues. So, around 900 BCE, they conquered Messenia, which was this real big region to the west of them, I believe. Because that's where all the good farmland was, and turned its population into this whole big slave population, which has its own Greek term, the Helots. And this is when the Constitution of Lycurgus was instituted in order to militarize Sparta. And again, all of this is why Sparta was what it was. The massive slave population to feed Sparta, you've got more slaves than free people. You need to make sure that the people can keep the slaves from revolting. So you've got to make sure every able-bodied male is essentially a soldier, and that's when we have Sparta becoming what it's known for. So Sparta is one of the bigger cities that has some level of monarchy. Not much, not what we think of later in Europe. They have two kings of equal power, but mostly they're just representatives to the outside world. You know, like for example, Leonidas, who died in the fight against the Persians, he was more of a representative to the outside world as opposed to like some big ruler in Sparta. It wouldn't be like, you know, the king of England dying in battle. And no, I've got to see who the next king is. There was another king in Sparta running things while he was out dying in battle. In fact, the actual people running Sparta was this council of elders who were, you know, well-known warriors. They were the ones who actually had the power. And as I mentioned, they formed the Peloponnesian League to maintain peace in Peloponnesia because, again, they couldn't really afford to go out and fight other cities because they were so busy keeping their slaves from rising up and murdering them. Because, in large part, due to the grueling training regimen of becoming a soldier in Sparta, not many people survived it. So if you survived and made it to being a Spartan soldier, you were going to be one of the best warriors in the Greek world. But most of the time you didn't survive it. So while other cities could field, you know, armies of 10,000, 20,000, Sparta could field armies of a few hundred. That was usually it. Now, granted, their armies could usually overwhelm armies much larger than them, but they couldn't afford to send their armies out because, again, they needed their guys home to keep the slaves from rebelling. So it was a delicate process. So here we have a map. For some reason, the only thing I could find was Greek, I think. Not Greek, French. Anyway, here is Sparta. Again, it was initially landlocked. They've got this river here. They took over Arcadia, or Messenia, sorry, or here. Arcadia is further to the north. They took over Messenia, basically this whole region. Oh, and this is the mountain that if the child was born with like disfigurement or in some way seemed like the gods disapproved of them, you'd chuck them from this mountain. Corinth. So Corinth was literally between Athens and Sparta. Like geographically, it was halfway between Athens and Sparta. It also was sitting on the isthmus between the Peloponnesus landmass and the rest of Greece. So, due to the massive walls that they built around the city, they could literally shut down land travel between Greece and Peloponnesus. So they were an important ally. Everybody wanted to be friends with Corinth because Corinth had a very strong central location. Also, due to being on an isthmus, and again, if you don't know what an isthmus is, it's a thin strip of land between two other bits of land, like Panama is, Isthmus of Panama. So they had water on both sides, so they could trade in both directions. Even Athens only was on one side of the Gulf of Corinth. So again, when Athens and Sparta were fighting one another, both sides were doing their best to make friends with Corinth. For the most part, it was an oligarchy. It was ruled by a powerful few. Usually, the rich folk were in charge. But it wasn't ruled by, like, a monarchy. It wasn't ruled by an aristocracy. It was ruled by the people who had power, not necessarily the people who were born into it. So also here is, so here's Corinth. There's a canal there now, but this is a modern day map. So that's where Corinth was. There's Athens. Sparta was down here. Also, by the way, if you do the default topic, you write on Athens and Sparta. Athens was not the capital of Greece. There was not a capital of Greece back then. It's the capital of Greece now, but back then each city-state was its own thing. So I don't want to see Athens was the capital of Greece. Like, it was not. It is now, but we're not talking about now. Okay, Thebes. This will actually become more important in the next chapter, but we'll go ahead and mention it now. Thebes was far to the north. Well, I mean, I say far. It was north of Athens. Actually, not. It was directly north of Athens. Northern Boeotia Plains, fertile agriculture. But unlike Athens, they didn't have like mountains around them or, ports. They were landlocked. They didn't have, natural barriers. So unlike Sparta, rather than conquering and enslaving the people around them, they created a federation of independent cities for the common good. Now that has to assume that everybody gets along and nobody tries to conquer you. But when it works out pretty well. Like with Corinth, they had a stable oligarchy. It worked out pretty well. Unfortunately for Thebes, they supported Persia at the Battle of Plataea. So Athens punished them with trade embargoes and basically made them look like villains to the rest of Greece. However, as we're going to see, are we going to get to? Yeah, we might get to the Peloponnesian League. As we're going to see a little bit later, when Athens and Sparta really go at it, they end up joining Sparta due to Athens' rather aggressive stance. So here again we have, Thebes was very powerful for a little while, and they will come up again later. All right, and the one we've been waiting for, Athens. Again, Athens had like the perfect spot. Again, to use a metaphor from empire building games, it's like they chose the easy, or really the very easy spawn point. They got everything. Ring by mountains, so they only really had to build like one wall for defense. Three of their directions were covered by mountains. The hinterland beyond the city was fertile, so they had wheat and olives easy to grow, so they didn't have to worry about food. Had access to the sea over a wide area for trade. I feel like they also had large silver deposits, so like they didn't even have to worry about trading for money. They had their own money to print. They had like really good just natural resources and geographic benefits. Yeah, got ahead of myself. Attica, which is the hinterland, what is what it's called. Rich with silver. So due to just how well off Athens was, rather than suppress the natives, they allowed all free men to become citizens. Because again, this is, ancient Greece, can't be too progressive. All free men could become citizens, so no slaves, no women, but hey, if you're not a woman and you're not a slave and you happen to have a little bit of land, you can be a citizen and vote. So, and don't worry about all the various names here, but this was the moment when the idea of letting the citizens vote. There was a struggle between two aristocratic families. Don't worry about the guy. He just suggested an assembly of the demes. Again, the demes are the people, the masses. So yeah, the rather than just having people show up and shout their vote and whoever is loudest gets the vote, this would actually have an assembly for the people outside of Athens. Now again, Athenian democracy was very qualified. You had to be free, you had to be male, and you had to own land, but this was a big change in politics from, ancient history. But compared to modern day democracy, it's very antiquated. Which, to be fair, free, male, and land owning was actually how our early voting was set up. You had to obviously not be a slave, and women couldn't vote, and there was actually like a land policy thing to voting in very early American history. So it wasn't that different from when we started out. So this is the Delian League. This is the league that Athens put together. Now the reason it's called the Delian League is because technically, for goodness sake, technically it was centered around Delos, which is this island out here in the middle. But realistically, it was centered around Athens. There were some allies that weren't technically part of the league, but then you've got these other members out here, which we'll get to later. So yeah, that's Athens. We've got a little bit of time to start the Peloponnesian War, or at least get into, yeah. Okay. So, with Persia being defeated, the Greeks continued to fight each other because, again, that's what the Greeks were good at. Using new strategies to gain the upper hand. Again, Athens wanted to unite the Greeks against Persia. But a lot of Greeks saw this as excuse me, saw this as Athens just having an excuse to gain more power. Which, to be fair, yeah. Because if this wasn't just, oh, all the Greeks are going to come together and work against Persia, it was all the Greeks are going to come together under Athens against Persia. So again, we had the Delian League, as I mentioned, to continue the fight against the Persians. The Peloponnesian League, which I mentioned, run by Sparta, pulled out of the Greek coalition once they had pushed the Persians out of Greece. So once Persia was no longer a concern, the Peloponnesian League is just like, yeah, okay, we're not involved anymore because that's the problem gone. The whole point was push the Persians out. Persians are gone. We're done. We're going to go back to our little landmass over here and make sure the slaves don't murder us, and that's the whole thing. In fact, Sparta suggested that they bring the Ionian Greeks back to mainland Greece because, hey, that's the whole reason the Persians invaded, because they took the Greeks over and then the Greeks revolted and it pissed the Persians off and then they came back, and why don't we just bring the Greeks back so we don't have to worry about them anymore? However, the Athenians and the Delian League continued pushing into Ionia and actually caused Persia to pull out of Ionia entirely. So Persia's starting to look a little bit weak. Though again, if you guys recall, Persia's massive. So I used a little strike through thing here. So the Delian League, or Athenian Empire, expanded within the league. Polis were pressured to adopt an Athenian-style democracy, which is not what the league was about. The league was about joining together in common defense against Persia, not about being made to do what Athens told you to do. And then they started conquering island Polis in Greece in the name of the Delian League, which is not what the league was about. The league was about fighting against Persia. But now they're conquering other Greek polis to force them into the league. The island polis of Naxos tried to withdraw because they're seeing that Athens has lost its damn mind. But of course, Athens attacked it and forced them back into the league. They also began conquering polis between itself and Corinth, which removed the buffer zone that was often, that had been there from the start between Corinth and Athens, which actually pushed Corinth into the Peloponnesian League. So Corinth, the in-between polis, the one that Athens and Sparta both want to have on their side, Athens' aggressive stance caused it to go to Sparta's side because they realized that next thing that's going to happen is Athens is going to try to take them over. So let's go ahead and have Sparta help us out because Athens has gone crazy. So Athens went north, conquering Polis and Boeotia. Sparta sent aid to Thebes, which again ended up pulling Thebes into the Peloponnesian League. So this did result in a brief conflict in 456 to 455 BCE, so a little brief conflict over the winter. So there was a treaty which was meant to last 30 years. So this was, hey, we know there's going to be more fighting between us because it's Athens and Sparta, and we've got the Greek world basically split in two. Let's put this off for a little while. Oh, sorry. I thought I had that. Let's put this off for a while. We'll come back to it in 30 years. We'll all be dead. We'll let our kids take care of it. And immediately after this, Athens took the treasury, the Delian League treasury, from the island of Delos, of the Delian League, and brought it to Athens, and had the other members of the Delian League pay their dues to Athens. Because when you're in a league like this, you either pay your dues to the league by giving ships or soldiers, or usually just money, in order to keep the league strong. Instead, Athens is just like, give us money or we'll attack you. Athens had become a full-on mob boss. So here we have the split in the Greek world. You've got Sparta down here in red. You've got the Peloponnesian League in lighter red. You've got the... Wait. This must have been before, because it's showing Boeotia as Athenian, or Delian League, but that's not right. This must have been before. Anyway, and then you've got Athens and all of this, including the yellow. But despite this, they're dealing with Sparta. So we'll see how that goes for them. So let's go a little bit further, and then we'll just have a couple of slides left on Wednesday before we get into chapter 3. So, Pericles. He was this big, important Athenian politician. There's a ton of crap written about him because the Athenians love to write about themselves. He had the support of many Athenian politicians, or Athenian citizens, and he was very imperialistic. He was the one that moved the Delian treasury to Athens, and also began using it to pay for civil construction projects. In other words, he used this money that was meant to be used for the whole league to build crap in Athens, which isn't what it's supposed to be used for, but I mean, who cares? They're Athenians. He had a very strong anti-Sparta policy. This wasn't as bad as what we'll see later in Rome, where this one senator would end every speech with, "And Carthage must be destroyed." But I mean, this guy was one of the main reasons why the Peloponnesian War ended up happening. So the winter after the war ended up breaking out, he gave his funeral oration, which is on page 68 and 69 in the book, which I remember having to read back when I was in your guys' place. It is rather good. It's a big propaganda speech about how great Athens is and how they're the light of civilization and how the Spartans are coming to get them because they're. I mean, it feels like every American propaganda piece during the Cold War and more recently about like anything in the Middle East, like, oh, they hate us because they hate our freedoms and they hate our way of life and brr, 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 brr. It's like that's how his speech is like, oh, they hate us because they hate our democracy and give me my beer. I mean, it's like it's this whole it's just a one big propaganda speech. And then he died the next year of like the plague. So let's start the war, and then we'll get into the rest of it next time. So the war, or the peace was was supposed to last 30 years. It did not last 30 years. So it broke in 431. The strategy for Athens was to pull all of its citizens behind their big, strong walls, let the Spartans burn everything down outside the walls, and the Athenians would use their navy to attack Sparta's allies. This is quite similar to what we'd have between Rome and Carthage later on. Again, I'm projecting hundreds of years into the future. But like, you've got a power that's mostly a naval power fighting a power that's mostly a land power. I like to compare it to back when my sister and I were children, and they had those like checkerboards out in front of Cracker Barrel, and I would put the white pieces on the white squares, and my sister would put the black pieces on the black squares. And you couldn't play checkers like that because the pieces would never interact. And that was how this felt, is if Athens isn't sending out any land troops, the Spartans can't fight the Athenians. And if Sparta doesn't really have a navy, they can't fight the Athenians. So it's like nobody's actually really interacting with each other. So not much was going on. Athens, I mean, they did shut themselves down behind their wall because they do have a big-ass wall. In fact, they've got like a double wall. But they weren't really able to break out. Sparta actually had Sparta didn't have a better navy than they thought, but Sparta's allies had better navies than Athens thought. However, by the next year, the Athenians realized what happened when you close yourselves in and stay in one place in a crowded city for a long period of time. Disease. So the Athenians started dying in large numbers, either from typhus or maybe even the bubonic plague. Like I said, that's what killed Pericles, we're pretty sure. Meanwhile, the Spartans kept the Delian members occupied, which made it harder for them to get to Athens to bring supplies. So there was a brief peace agreement in 421 BCE. They recognized the Athenian Empire. Sparta asked for aid in keeping its slave population under control, and nothing actually really happened otherwise. It was a really pointless phase of the war. A bunch of Athenians died inside their walls, and their ships didn't really do much, and that was it. The second phase was much more important. So here we have, okay, this one's more better. So for some reason they decided to put Athens in red and Sparta in blue. That's not what I'm used to seeing. So yeah, Sparta's in blue here. Obviously the Peloponnesian League down here, and then of course they've got Boeotia up there. Athens here, and pretty much the entire sea is under Athenian control. I don't know why Macedonia is under is a Spartan ally? That's weird. Macedonia is where Alexander the Great comes from, so that's interesting. Anyway, we'll get into the long second phase of the war and finish up this chapter on Wednesday. Yeah. So I'll get this up on Blackboard and do that later. So yeah, I'll see you guys on